Hi guys, thanks for tuning into Radio Viska. This is the episode 4. Today I think I wanted to talk a little bit about misinformation. So I read a lot of websites out there, news, fake news, real news, alternative news, mainstream news. And what strikes me is that really the narratives, they're just I mean, it's just a spectacle. Just to come back to what I said in my first introductory episode, the truth is always more complicated than any one news article or narrative is going to be able to portray. So, what you're left with as the average citizen is this pre-packaged simple explanation that the news media tries to sell you. So, by way of example, let's take, for example, the war in the Ukraine. This is actually still going on. It is now April 2017. There has been exchange of fire recently. There have been shellings recently. I'm not aware of any yesterday, but certainly in the early months of 2017, there have been firefights. Now, is this something you hear about in the mainstream media anymore? No. Let's ask ourselves, why don't we hear about it? Why is the Ukrainian war essentially disappeared? That's a very interesting example of how the narrative is shaped by the mainstream media. If you think about it, for Europeans, especially for Hungarians, Slovakians, Czechs, Polish, Germans, Serbians, even French and British, the happenings in the Ukraine should be more important than what's going on in North Korea. But my suspicion is, this is my hunch about why we don't hear much about the Ukraine anymore, is that I actually think the CIA has given up, or they've put it on the back burner. They've essentially, they may not have admitted immediate defeat, but they have moved on to, so to speak, bigger and better things because they weren't able to achieve what they could achieve, what they wanted to achieve in the Ukraine, which was take over Crimea and have a hostile force on the border to Russia, the same way they have in the Baltic states. So and in some ways they have achieved what they want already as well. So this is a sort of it's not a complete defeat. It's not a complete victory. They have obviously been able to use the conflict as an excuse to station troops all along the Russian border. I mean, there's constant exercises. There's also these, aimed at Iran missile interceptor batteries in Romania, I believe, in Bulgaria. I'm not sure if they're in the Baltics, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think in Poland. Yeah, sure. That's for Iranian missiles, you know. I mean, sometimes the narrative is so shockingly bad as well, with these propaganda explanations that you ask yourself, who's making this shit up? Or do they really think we're complete idiots? And maybe they think we are because they've been able to fool us for so long. But to get back to the whole lack of real reporting about Ukraine, I think there was a bit of a media war there as well, like an actual para propaganda war between Russia and the West. And I am by no means, Slava Ukraine. I don't deny the Ukraine its right to existence, and I'm very aware, despite my last tongue-in-cheek podcast, of the terrible history that the Ukrainians have suffered under the Soviets. And this is a key point. It was the Soviet Union. And I'm not entirely sure that that's the same as Russia today. There's obviously a lot of overlap. But to get back to it, so, despite this also being a complicated conflict, we have to understand, we have to accept that the Americans, the CIA, used whatever animosity was there, used whatever, valid and invalid concerns existed in the Ukraine for their own purposes. And this did not benefit the Ukrainians, this did not benefit the Russians in the Ukraine, this did not benefit Russia. This was part of an ongoing campaign to expand NATO. Let's call it what it is. This is a expansion of empire. It's plain and simple. Now, would Ukrainians have fared a lot better if they had been immediately sort of taken into the EU, if somehow the Russians had been forced to abandon Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk? I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. First of all, I think that's a scenario that just wasn't possible. Might have been part of the planning, in the CIA color revolution crew. They probably would have thought, okay, the Russians are not going to give up Crimea, but we're going to be able to paint them as the bad guys because they're going to have to occupy it. I mean, if you look at how these conflicts are gamed out, they do use extensive game theory modeling on any operation they do. That this is what the RAND Corporation is for. This is what they excel in, essentially. They figure out any possibility, any possible outcome that they can imagine. And this doesn't mean they're perfect and they're all-knowing and that they're actually going to predict it correctly, but they're going to game theory as many possible scenarios as they can come up with. And game theory is not totally without merit. Not at all. It has merit. The problem is the world is quite complicated and you cannot predict a complicated world in the same way as simple game theory structures. But I mean, that's another topic. So, yes, the conflict in the Ukraine probably didn't achieve all of the desired outcomes that the CIA and the establishment of the American neocon elite wanted, but it certainly established a lot of propaganda goals. It probably just really got bogged down in the face of far superior Russian equipped rebel forces. And I'm not, okay, I shouldn't call them far superior, but they were certainly able to hold their ground, and the cost in manpower and equipment and just devastation and money as well that this conflict caused the West Ukraine, the rump Ukraine, was something that was not sustainable. I mean, if you look at the actual battle history, and this is very obscure, I mean, you basically cannot really obtain this information from Western mainstream sources. I mean, there's Vice News, which is a sort of American slash Canadian CIA inspired outfit. They did a lot of on the ground reporting from the Ukraine, but they didn't really give you a picture of the battle space. They didn't really provide you with numbers, dead, you know, troop movements, actual defeats, strategic tactical information at all. This you really only got from the Russian side. And there was a lot of, what you would call patriotic Russian websites out there that provided at least maps, at least sort of information about the front, about where flashpoints were, where attacks happened, where, like a proper sort of military breakdown of events. Now, do I believe all of it? No, I don't. But it certainly seemed a lot more accurate and a lot more, should I call, closer to the truth at least, than what you heard from the Western outlets. And this is, I mean, there's crazy battles. I mean, I had followed that conflict quite closely, and there was, several cauldrons of Ukrainian troops that were just devastated, and I'm talking they were massacred. The typical Russian backed separatists, because I don't believe they were all Russian little green men. I think there were locals amongst them, but there certainly was support from Russia. These Donetsk DPR, I can't remember the actual official terms they give themselves, but let's call them the Donetsk militia. They inflicted very heavy casualties on the Ukrainian troops. And the Ukrainian troops were also very badly equipped in some cases, very badly organized. You had, the sort of what the Americans now call MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, or what the Wehrmacht called the Stalin Orgel, this sort of just areas of scorched earth of Ukrainian movement formations completely wiped out by just heavy rocket barrages. And there's footage of this. I mean, this is not staged. The separatists walked into these areas afterwards, and it looked like the highway of death in Kuwait. I mean, you had just miles of charred bodies, charred trucks, charred tanks. So now you could argue that despite these victories in these cauldrons, that these sort of localized victories, that the entire region Donetsk and the entire region of Lugansk is not held by the separatists. There's significant portions of it that are held by the Ukrainian armed forces. Sure. But nevertheless, for what I believe the separatists were trying to hold on to, which was the capital cities, they essentially won or fought to a stalemate. And Crimea was a hands down victory, and that was to be expected. I mean, this idea that Crimea is really Ukrainian, I think even Ukrainian ultranationalists do have to admit that that's not really a sort of traditionally Ukrainian territory. I mean, it was held by the Turks, sort of a Tatar republic. It was part of the Russian Empire per se, since the late 1700s. So basically, as long as the United States exists. And then, if I if I remember correctly, I think in 1953 or so, it was sort of arbitrarily attached to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. These Soviet republics, they weren't really, they were sort of part of the Soviet Union, of this one nation, the Soviet Union empire. So the borders of the Soviet republics don't necessarily fully reflect ethnic and nation, like the prior nations. Although they do to some large degree. I mean, but Russia itself, if you look at the Caucasus and, the Chechens and Dagestan and Ingushetia and all these nations, they're not Russians. So Russia's always been an empire. It has always been, what you might term colonial in a sense. And the Soviet Union was just more of that. So that's the case with Crimea. It's really not Ukraine, the same way as Chechnya is not really Russia per se. But they do have some historical territorial claim to it, absolutely. Now, since that shooting down of the airliner, which, had, oh gosh, and it was mainly Dutch and Australian victims from what I remember, so the propaganda there was just ridiculous. I don't think it has ever been conclusively proven one way or another. And this is a big problem with the media. I mean, clearly the Western media would portray it as 100%, some Russian separatist controlled missile system or something. But I've looked into this and the evidence is pretty flimsy. And certainly what the Russian Ministry of Defense had to say was that there was some jets flying around in the area and that the missile could not have come from separatist controlled areas. So, gosh, who knows? Do I think that the Russians deliberately shot the plane down? No, I don't think so. Do I think that the Ukrainians potentially shot it down to blame on the Russians? It's, from what I've been exposed to, from what I've read, that is more likely, I actually think, if you want to go down the conspiracy route. I think the most likely explanation actually is that it was just a mistake by either side, who knows which side. And so the propaganda value obviously has been just milked, right? But you can only milk something so long until the public does get tired of it, right? And until it becomes obvious, even to the most brainwashed, fluoride drinking, blue pill TV zombie. So, what's happened there? I think this is sort of an example of how the news media in the mainstream is literally controlled by the intelligence services, or the agenda, that which is to be spoken about is determined by not the journalists, sort of free and independent journalists, but by the wider propaganda apparatus. And this propaganda apparatus probably has several sources, whether it's the banking industry, whether it's the Pentagon, whether it's the CIA, whether it's other think tanks. There's obviously several sources of propaganda. But in this moment in time, it looks like none of them are interested in pushing a big sort of amount of news about Ukraine, so you don't hear about it. Despite actual gun battles in Europe happening there right now. Look it up. It's not, there's no ceasefire holding. Certainly since January this year, and potentially since the election of Trump, it might have something to do with it. Although, you know, this is pure speculation. But certainly since then, there have been gun battles there again, and I believe people have died. So it just shows you the current focus is North Korea, current focus is Syria. And maybe Syria is, even that's not really the focus anymore. You know, something happened there, some missiles, some God knows what staged chemical attack videos. I'm pretty certain they're staged, or not how they are being presented at least. And then that just disappears, right? And then that war rages on for another 2 years or so, and you don't hear about it really until they want you to hear about it again the next time. So it's all just a spectacle. And you should pay attention. You should come up with your own list of things, your own, so to speak, spider web of the things tugging at you, the spider web strings that make you bounce around in your field of reality. You know, it's kind of a bad analogy. Basically, what I'm trying to say is figure out what affects you. So a global nuclear war, yes, it will affect you. So then figure out what could cause a global nuclear war, but then also think about, will they maybe use this fear of a global nuclear war just to kind of get me to do what they want me to do, and to brainwash me, to pump fear into me? So rather than, you know, playing catch up with every news story they put out there, with every spectacle that gets created, sit back and figure out for yourself what is going to affect your life, what you need to do in life, what is news for you. And the most important news for you might be, they just opened a refugee home next to me, you know, down the street, and there's going to be 3,000 Iraqis living there, or 3,000 Afghans. Now, that's going to affect you a shit ton more than Kim Jong-un. That's your news. Or, you know, Monsanto just sprayed all the fields with Roundup just behind my house. That's your news. Not bloody Kim Jong-un. You know, or some supposed chemical attack in some village in central Syria. Whether it's true or not. But they want you sitting in front of the TV, worrying about what they want you to worry about, rather than worrying about your issues. So, yeah, create your own filter, essentially. You know, people always complain about filter bubbles and echo chambers. No, you need to create, in this oversaturated world of propaganda, you need to think about everything you hear critically. There's tens of thousands of people who have read Edward Bernays and who are using his theories to turn you into their slave, essentially. To become the microchip on the cockroach so that they can remote control the cockroach, you know? They want you to be a mind-controlled robot that they can control like a little drone with a remote control called the news media. I just want to add to, let me turn this off. I just want to add to what I just said as well. Something that may have gone fairly unnoticed, you know, amongst a lot of people in the United States and Europe, but there's just been another country joining NATO. So Montenegro 2 days ago voted, I believe it was something like 46 votes to 0 votes against it to ratify NATO membership. Now, I think the reason there was 0 votes against it was because the pro-Russian establishment, or the historically, I mean, Montenegro is essentially sort of like Serbia. There's a lot of Serbs that live there as well, I believe, and it's a very small country. I mean, I don't think they even have 1 million people. But nevertheless, they historically have friendship with Russia, and so almost half the lawmakers boycotted this vote against for NATO ratification, which means that really half of the country's representatives are against it, but the vote is 46 to 0. So that just happened. So the push eastwards by the American empire, I think, is pretty obvious. There's going to be more, more focus on Georgia again at some point. Chechnya is probably under control by Ramzan Kadyrov and by Russia. But I don't think you can portray this war as a purely Russian aggression when you see one country after another being swallowed by the NATO empire. And you see all these missile interceptor batteries being built all along the Russian frontier. And many people have warned, one of them is a fairly well-known writer who used to be part of the US government, actually. He used to be Assistant Secretary to the Treasury under Reagan. His name is Paul Craig Roberts. He argues, that the United States is trying to put all the chess pieces into place to be able to threaten a preemptive strike or potentially carry out a preemptive strike. That's a preemptive nuclear strike on Russia. Being able to do that essentially by being able to intercept any retaliatory strike, or even creating the sense that it is possible and that Russia basically doesn't really have the nuclear deterrent anymore, which would potentially cause the United States to have an upper hand in diplomacy. So, I mean, I don't think the BBC reports on this. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there would have been. The sad thing is I don't actually watch all that much mainstream media. I'm basically given up to it. So I'm sort of sickened by it. And every time I do, investigate or do read what I go to, say, the New York Times or the BBC website, I mean, I just want to puke, essentially. So I'm not totally aware of what they're doing all the time because I avoid it. I'd assume there was some news article, some mention of Montenegro's accession to NATO. But is that the number one, item on the agenda that everyone's aware of? That, one country after another is being swallowed up into NATO? Is that something that the news media is portraying in that way? The Russian concern about that as well? No. So I just wanted to add that to my previous stuff about the Ukrainian conflict. Cool. Thanks for watching, guys, and talk to you soon. Bye.